I was supposed to sit at the table with them, not in the storage room, next to a stack of broken folding chairs and dusty vases from my mother's wedding. But I didn't come to that reunion just to be humiliated. I came with evidence. Before we begin the story, how old are you, and where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know. Now, enjoy the story. My name is Amber. I'm 29 years old, and last month my grandfather left me his entire estate, over $2 million worth of property, stock, and business assets. I'd always known I was close to him. I just didn't realize how far that would set me apart from the rest of my family. Especially from my mother. It was the day after the funeral when she pulled me aside. Patricia, in her signature camel trench coat and impossible-to-ignore perfume, didn't even offer condolences. She just leaned in, her manicured nails tightening around my wrist, and said, "You're going to sign it over to me, right? It's only fair." When I said no, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even blink. I just said it calmly, as if saying no to her was a normal thing. As if I hadn't spent my entire life being trained to fold. That was when the mask slipped. What followed was a week of silence broken by a text message this morning: family meeting. Be at the house by 10. I already knew what it meant. My stomach had been tight for days, like it was bracing for something my mind wasn't ready to admit. The house still smelled like lemon polish and secrets. I walked into the living room, the one where I used to sneak cookies from the sideboard and fall asleep during storms on Grandpa's lap. Now it was staged like a courtroom. My mother sat like a queen in exile, surrounded by my stepfather Craig, my sister Rachel, and my brother Jason. Two men in gray suits stood beside her, their briefcases lined up like weapons. Patricia smiled. "Amber," she said, "meet our lawyers." No one offered me a seat. I stayed standing. What happened next wasn't just a legal ambush. It was a moral assassination, and I watched it play out with the kind of detached stillness that comes from growing up with these people. They accused me of manipulating my grandfather during his final days. They claimed undue influence, coercion, elder abuse. Words they had only just learned, sharp and brittle, falling from their mouths like broken teeth. I stood there with my heart pounding so loudly I thought they might hear it. But I said nothing. Because I didn't come here to argue. I came with documentation. I came with signed letters. Video messages. Notarized amendments to his will. I came with proof. But I didn't show my hand, not yet. I let them play their parts. I let Patricia gloat and my siblings squirm with anticipation. Because there's something cruelly beautiful about letting someone believe they've won, right before they realize the game hasn't even started. And just as one of the lawyers reached for a manila folder, I said, calmly, "You might want to wait before you proceed." Every head turned. And in that single moment, I knew exactly how this was going to end. What I didn't know, not yet, was how far they'd go to keep what was never theirs. And how alone I'd feel even with justice on my side. Because standing up for yourself is never just about money. It's about choosing the truth over peace. Even if it costs you your family. They always assumed silence meant surrender. But silence, in our family, was how power survived. As my mother stared at me across the room, smug, confident, already celebrating a victory that hadn't yet arrived, I saw it. That flicker in her eye. That thing I'd grown up with but never named, the belief that I owed her everything. And the terrifying part was, for a long time I believed it too. But not anymore. I had spent years preparing for this, though I didn't know it at the time. Not with court filings or lawyers. With something older, quieter, and far more enduring: memory. The man who built everything they now wanted to steal taught me to see through people before they opened their mouths. He did it gently, the way a craftsman teaches a child to sand wood, not with lectures, but with presence. I'd sit across from Grandpa in his office while he reviewed invoices, silently handing him one after the other. He never rushed me. "You'll learn faster by watching than asking," he used to say, not unkindly. People will show you who they are if you stop trying to explain yourself. He knew my mother. He knew all of them. He'd watched her spiral through money like it was oxygen, always justifying the next indulgence. I still remember her shouting matches with him, over the phone, through the walls, at family gatherings when she thought no one else was listening. She has no idea what that man sacrificed, he told me once, after another fight that ended in tears and slammed doors. And I've spent a lifetime covering her mistakes. That was the day he gave me the spare key to his filing cabinet. I was 17. There will come a time, he said, when no one else will remember the truth. It was more than a warning. It was a responsibility. Over the years, I learned what he meant by truth, and what he didn't. Truth wasn't just the deeds and balances and account ledgers. It was also the small things. The handwritten notes he left in the margins of documents. The receipts he kept from every donation. The photos in his desk drawer, not the framed ones in the hallway, but the ones he didn't display. Of us in the store. Of me helping him count out register drawers during inventory weekends. Of the life we shared that no one else wanted to see. He called them his anchors. His word, not mine. Even then, I think he knew what was coming. And now here I was, standing in the eye of it. The lawyer closest to my mother cleared his throat. "We'll need to verify certain decisions made in Mr. Harold's final months," he said carefully, as if stepping onto thin ice. "Some of the documents we've seen raise questions about his mental capacity." My brother Jason nodded too quickly. Rachel looked away. My mother didn't flinch. I didn't answer. Instead, I pulled the small leather folder from my bag and set it gently on the coffee table between us. "This is from his final financial audit," I said. "Conducted 6 weeks before he passed. Reviewed and signed by 2 third-party evaluators, neither of whom had any connection to our family." My voice didn't shake. The room fell quiet in the way only a guilty room can. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, but I kept my hands folded. Craig reached for the folder but hesitated. My mother gave him a subtle nod, and he opened it. 1 page. Just one. But it was enough. Grandpa's signature, strong and unmistakable, beneath a clear statement of intent. Notarized. Dated. Independent. The lawyer leaned forward. "May we make copies?" I nodded once. My mother's jaw tightened. I could see her doing the math, recalculating her strategy without letting it show. That was always her talent, not hiding her feelings, but hiding the fact that she had no feelings worth showing. Rachel, who hadn't said a word, whispered, "Is this real?" I didn't respond. I wasn't here to comfort anyone. Afterward, in the quiet of the guest bathroom, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. The same face I'd always had, but different now. Not stronger, not colder. Clearer. It wasn't just about the inheritance. It never had been. It was about the unspoken contract we all grew up under, that I would carry their shame so they could keep pretending they had none. And I was finally done. Later, while they murmured in the living room, regrouping, recalculating, I slipped out the back door, letting it shut softly behind me. The sun had started to set, casting that dim golden light over the backyard where Grandpa used to build raised planters every spring. The soil had long since dried out. The fence was starting to rot. I stood there for a long time. And that's when I realized something I hadn't expected to feel. I wasn't afraid of losing them. I was afraid I'd waited too long to lose them. I turned and walked back into the house, ready for what they'd do next. Because if they thought I was done fighting, they still didn't understand who raised me. They didn't speak when I re-entered the room. But their silence wasn't surrender. It was calculation. Patricia had shifted her body slightly toward the lawyer, as if realigning the center of gravity in the room. Craig was whispering something to Jason, whose eyes flickered between me and the folder as though trying to follow a script he hadn't read in full. Rachel hadn't moved, though her thumb rubbed nervously along the seam of her jeans, a habit she'd had since childhood. The air felt thinner now. Like it had passed through a filter of blame and shame before reaching my lungs. I sat down slowly, not at the main table, but at one of the edge chairs. The storage room might have been their idea of punishment. But I wasn't here to be comforted. I was here to bear witness. Their next move came quickly. The second lawyer, the younger one with the polished shoes and hollow smile, leaned forward and said, "Amber, if we may, we'd like to propose a compromise. One that acknowledges your grandfather's wishes, while also maintaining family unity." Unity. The word landed like a slap. I said nothing. He continued, as if my silence were permission, "Given the size of the estate and its potential to create division, we'd like to draft a temporary conservatorship. You'd retain legal ownership, of course, but the financial decisions would be guided by a collective vote from the family." I didn't flinch. I'd expected something like this, a veiled redistribution, dressed up in the language of fairness. Before I could respond, Patricia chimed in, "It's only fair that we all have a say. Your grandfather would have wanted that." I turned my head slowly toward her. Not fast enough to startle, but enough to shift the mood again. I said, "You mean the grandfather who specifically excluded you from his business holdings?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth, once spoken, doesn't require echo. But something changed after that moment. Not visibly, no one stood or screamed or threw anything. But the emotional terrain cracked, just enough to start letting something darker through. They stopped trying to disguise their intentions. Jason stood abruptly, pacing a few feet before mumbling something about deserved shares and decades of family contribution. Rachel stayed seated, but when she spoke, her voice was thin, brittle. "He wouldn't want us fighting like this," she said. It might have carried weight if she hadn't said it while staring at her phone. Later that night, after they'd finished their performance of diplomacy, I returned to my apartment. My coat still smelled faintly of lemon polish and tension. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the dark tell the truth. Because this was no longer about the will. It was about a lifetime of silence being held up to the light. The pressure didn't come all at once. It came quietly, like erosion. A missed call from my mother one day. 3 voice messages the next, all variations on the same theme. "We need to resolve this as a family. You're making things harder than they have to be." He was confused, "Amber. You can't deny that." Then Craig started texting. Pleasant, at first. Civil, he offered to mediate, whatever that meant. Then the tone changed, suggestions of delays in probate, references to legal inconsistencies, subtle implications that I was emotionally unstable. I stopped replying after he accused me of clinging to something that didn't belong to me in spirit, even if it did on paper. That was the phrase that broke something in me. Because they weren't just challenging my claim. They were challenging my memory. They were rewriting the years I spent at Grandpa's side, turning Saturdays in the store into manipulation, private talks into coercion, quiet love into a transaction. The manipulation wasn't loud. It was woven into everything, the way they spoke about me to relatives, the sudden shift in tone when they spoke to me, the way Rachel started forwarding me emails from the probate attorney with passages highlighted, as if to imply incompetence. But it was Patricia who turned it into a campaign. A week later, I received a notice, a formal petition to contest the will. The grounds were vague but loaded: undue influence, diminished capacity, failure to update beneficiaries appropriately. It wasn't just an attempt to take what wasn't theirs. It was an erasure. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. I could almost hear her voice in the legalese, distant, elegant, venomous. I could hear the years she spent painting herself as the dutiful daughter, while secretly tallying every slight, every financial loss, every perceived betrayal. I didn't cry. Instead, I booked a consultation with a probate attorney the next morning. His office was on the 32nd floor, overlooking the bay. Polished floors. Quiet receptionist. A place built for discretion. He reviewed the documents for 10 minutes before speaking. He said, "They're testing you. Seeing how much you'll tolerate before folding. I said, they think I'm bluffing. He nodded. Are you? I looked out the window, the water below gleaming under a weak winter sun. I said, no. He leaned back in his chair. Then we'll fight. But that night, in the solitude of my kitchen, pouring a glass of wine I barely sipped, the cost began to settle in. There were no calls from friends. No text from Rachel, no apology. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was strategic. Because when your family decides you're the enemy, they don't rage. They erase. Even people who'd once hugged me at holidays stopped replying to messages. My cousin Clara, who I'd shared bunk beds with at Thanksgiving when we were kids, suddenly unfollowed me on social media. My aunt, who once called me the responsible one, sent a short message, "This is bigger than you, Amber. Don't ruin it for everyone." I wasn't just losing family. I was losing the illusion that I ever had one. I did everything I could to stay grounded, yoga in the mornings, long walks after work, cooking meals I barely tasted. But even silence, when it stretches long enough, becomes its own kind of pressure. The only person who truly understood was my best friend, Elise. She met me for lunch on a gray Sunday. We sat by the window of a small cafe, the kind of place where they bring your tea in mismatched porcelain cups and let you sit for hours. She said, "You don't have to justify this. Not to me. Not to anyone." I didn't answer right away. Eventually, I said, "They're trying to bury the version of him that loved me." She nodded slowly, reaching for my hand. "They can't," she said. "He left it all to you for a reason." I nodded. But inside, I still felt the undertow. That night, I received an anonymous email. No subject line. No sender name. Just one sentence. "You don't know everything he did." I read it 3 times. And then I felt something I hadn't expected. Not fear. But curiosity. Because maybe I didn't. And maybe, just maybe, that's where this story really began. He left me everything, and still, there were pieces of him I hadn't been given. The email sat in my inbox like a riddle. No name, no context. Just that one line, "You don't know everything he did." I didn't delete it. I read it every night before bed, like a warning, or a promise. It didn't feel like a threat. Not exactly. It felt like someone reaching out from the margins of the story, pointing to a page I hadn't turned yet. So I started digging. Not emotionally, not yet. Strategically. I went back through the estate files, everything the lawyers had given me, everything I'd kept. I created a spreadsheet of his business properties, cross-referenced sale agreements, tax statements, even scanned the margins of old contracts for notes in his handwriting. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. But I knew how to recognize what didn't fit. 3 discrepancies showed up in the first hour. One property listed as a pending sale had actually been sold a year prior, the funds redirected into a secondary trust account with no named beneficiary. Another asset, a commercial building in Denver, had been placed under the management of a firm I'd never heard of, despite Grandpa's history of overseeing everything in-house. And then there was the note. Buried in an old folder labeled "Deferred Liabilities," a handwritten line in the corner of a page. "Keep this away from Patricia. She'll spin it." I sat back in my chair, staring at those words until they lost meaning. He knew. Not just about their intentions, that was obvious. He knew they'd come for it all. And he had tried, in his own quiet way, to leave me a map. But he'd also hidden things. And the more I looked, the clearer it became. There were assets unaccounted for, decisions made in secret, documents redacted or folded into misleading summaries. He hadn't just protected me. He protected something else. That realization didn't make me feel safer. It made me feel watched. The anonymous email was only the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 more messages arrived. Each with a sentence, a hint, and always from a different address. Ask Craig about Denver. The trust fund wasn't supposed to be silent. He recorded everything. I printed them. Stored them in a locked drawer. Elise offered to run a digital trace, but I told her no. Whoever was sending them wanted me to look closer, not run away. So I did. I drove 3 hours to the Denver building, pretending to be a prospective tenant. The property manager was polite, vaguely nervous, and when I asked about the ownership history, she said something that didn't match the documents I had. She said, the management company's owned by a family trust. Same one your mother visits once a year. I didn't correct her. I just smiled, thanked her, and left, my pulse thrumming in my neck. Because my mother had no legal claim to anything. And yet she was still orbiting around pieces of the estate like they belonged to her. Or like she'd helped build them. Back in my car, I stared at the dashboard, suddenly aware of how little I truly knew about what Grandpa had tried to protect me from. This wasn't just about greed. It was about legacy, the version of it he gave me, and the version my mother was quietly rewriting in my absence. That night, I pulled the spare key from its hiding place, the one I hadn't touched in years, and drove to his main store. It was closed, of course, but the back door still worked, and the office upstairs hadn't changed since the last time we sat together, going over supplier contracts by lamplight. The old filing cabinet was there. Bottom drawer, far left. I had memorized the rhythm of its lock when I was 17. A soft click, then resistance. Inside, 3 thick binders, a sealed manila envelope, and a black notebook. The notebook was leather-bound, worn at the edges. And when I opened it, I found not numbers or account details, but entries. Short, deliberate, dated. He had kept a journal. Not of emotions, he wasn't that kind of man. But of events. Decisions. Warnings. I read until my eyes blurred. Entries about my mother. Her attempts to borrow against the business. Notations about Jason's gambling, Rachel's cosmetic emergencies, Craig's manipulation. But also entries about me. Amber flagged the discrepancy in the Jan ledger today. Sharp as ever. Proud doesn't cover it. She doesn't ask for anything. That worries me. If this goes wrong, she'll be alone. And I hate that. I pressed my hand to the page. There was something unspeakably intimate about being known like that. Not flattered. Not adored. But seen. By someone who chose to leave the world with me as his witness. The manila envelope contained copies of emails, correspondence between Grandpa and a law firm I didn't recognize. The name on the letterhead wasn't the firm that handled the estate. That alone made my breath catch. The emails were short, factual, but they referenced a contingency plan. A second trust. One meant to activate only under specific conditions, conditions that now, chillingly, were being met. I needed help. Not just a lawyer. A strategist. I contacted a former classmate, Marissa, now a forensic accountant. We hadn't spoken in 4 years. She answered on the second ring. She said, "You're calling about the inheritance, aren't you?" I paused. Then said, "How do you know?" She replied, "Because I saw your name on a trust document last month. One I wasn't supposed to see." My stomach dropped. She offered to meet me. Off the record. No emails, no calls. Just coffee, in a cafe 3 towns over. We met on a rainy Tuesday. She handed me a USB and a list of accounts. Offshore holdings. Real estate. Shell companies. Things that had Grandpa's fingerprints all over them, and none of which had been disclosed to the probate attorney. I said, "Why wasn't this included?" She looked me in the eye and said, "Because someone filed a suppression order using your mother's power of attorney from 2012. Before he revoked it." The world tilted a little. The manipulation wasn't new. It had just become more elegant. Back home, I sat on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by open folders and pages of Grandpa's notes, and I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to fight them through the channels they expected. I was going to dismantle the entire game. I'd start with the suppressed trust. Then the offshore accounts. Then the concealed property transfers. I'd track every signature, every file, every lie, and line them up like dominoes. Because this wasn't just about proving that I deserved what he left me. It was about proving that they never did. And in the center of it all, somewhere between memory and betrayal, I knew something deeper was waiting. Something he hadn't told me. And whoever sent those emails? They weren't finished yet. They thought I'd be too emotional to play their game. But emotion, when harnessed correctly, becomes precision. The day of the confrontation came without ceremony. No formal notice, no invitation. Just a brief message from my mother, meeting at the house. 3 p.m. mandatory. The word mandatory made me laugh. She was still trying to assert control through language, through old family roles, as if this were a PTA meeting I couldn't skip. I wore black slacks, a steel gray sweater, and no jewelry. I didn't want distraction. I wanted to be forgotten the second I walked in, until I opened my mouth. The house looked the same. Always did. White shutters, hedges trimmed too neatly, the heavy front door that creaked slightly on humid days. A facade of order covering years of quiet warfare. Inside, the air was unnaturally still. They were all seated in the dining room, just like before, as if the set had been rebuilt for a second act. Patricia at the head, Craig to her right, Jason next to him. Rachel across, flanked by the same lawyers from before. But this time, I brought mine. Marissa came with me. She wasn't a lawyer, but her presence mattered. She sat beside me silently, her laptop already open, fingers poised. My attorney, Michael Tan, had the calm composure of someone who'd seen enough families implode to know that legality was never the real battlefield. Patricia didn't rise. She said, "So this is how you want to do it? Lawyers and outsiders." I replied, "No. This is how you wanted to do it. I'm just meeting you there." Craig leaned forward. He said, "We don't have to destroy each other. You've made your point. Let's find a path forward." I nodded slightly and said, "Good. Then let's start with the offshore accounts." His face changed. Just slightly, but enough. Jason cleared his throat. "What accounts?" Marissa turned her screen. A list of transactions filled the display, dates, amounts, destinations. Every single one tied to shell companies linked to the estate. I watched as Patricia's hand closed around her glass like a vice. Michael spoke then, gently but without warmth. He said, "These transfers violate both the probate court's disclosure requirements and multiple clauses in the estate documentation. We've already submitted them to the judge overseeing the challenge." No one spoke for several seconds. Then Rachel, still clutching her phone like a lifeline, whispered, "I didn't know about any of this." Patricia didn't look at her. She said, "This is just interpretation. It's not proof of wrongdoing." Marissa answered her, "The signatures on the power of attorney are forged." That landed like thunder. Jason stood abruptly. His chair scraped hard against the wood. He said, "You're accusing us of fraud now?" I replied, "No. I'm proving it." Michael laid a folder on the table, carefully opening it to reveal the forensic report. Signature overlays. Expert testimony. A chain of custody. Patricia stayed still, but I saw her swallow hard. That's when I pulled out the black notebook. I didn't speak. I let it sit there, a quiet, familiar weight. She knew what it was. Craig said, "That's hearsay. Sentimental junk." I opened it to the page dated 2 months before Grandpa's death. Read it aloud. "Craig keeps pushing for access to the Denver assets. Told Patricia no again. They're desperate." Jason said, "That doesn't prove anything." I turned to another page. Amber warned me about the vendor overbilling. She sees it all. I trust her more than anyone. Marissa didn't look up, just kept scrolling. Michael said, "You're free to contest the will further. But if you do, be aware this goes public. Every transaction. Every forgery. Every breach." No one answered. They weren't ready for that. Not because they feared legal action, but because they feared exposure. In our family, reputation was currency. Patricia broke the silence. She said, "He was confused." "You know that?" I answered, "No." "He was disappointed. And he wrote it down." Rachel looked at me then. Really looked. Her expression softened, just briefly. She said, "Why didn't you tell me all this?" I replied, "Would you have believed me?" She didn't answer. Michael gathered the papers. Marissa shut her laptop. Patricia leaned back, the posture of someone recalculating. Not defeated. Just cornered. She said, "You think this is over?" I stood. "No," I said. "I think you've only just realized it started." Outside, the sky had turned a pale, dull gray. The kind that makes everything look flatter, less defined. Marissa walked beside me in silence. At the car, she said, "You were steady." I answered, "I had to be." "He asked me to be." She nodded. I didn't drive away immediately. I sat in the driver's seat, watching the windows of the house. The lights still glowed in the dining room. They were likely regrouping. Redrafting their next attempt. But this time, the weight of evidence was mine. And now I had something they couldn't steal. Control. Still, as I pulled away from the curb, I couldn't shake the feeling that something remained unfinished. That under all the numbers and documents and accusations, there was still one piece left unspoken. One thread I hadn't pulled. And someone, somewhere, still wanted me to. They didn't crumble. They retreated. Fallout doesn't always come in explosions. Sometimes, it arrives in quiet shifts, silence where there was once accusation, absence where there had always been surveillance. 3 days after the confrontation, Patricia's legal team formally withdrew their contestation of the will. No press release, no apology. Just a thin envelope sent by certified mail, the signature of their lead counsel precise and bloodless. Michael said it was a good outcome. He said, "This is how victory looks." Boring paperwork and a deadline they missed. I nodded. But inside, I felt nothing like victorious. The silence that followed wasn't relief, it was vacuum. The lawyers disappeared. The phone stopped ringing. Even the group texts, always mildly performative, mostly Rachel, went dead. Not even a hollow "Happy Easter" or a forwarded chain message. Just, nothing. They vanished like smoke. I wasn't surprised. But I was surprised by how easily they did it. How quickly they disbanded once the inheritance slipped from their grip. I suppose they assumed I would need them now. That wealth would make me desperate for connection, eager to display generosity in the name of family harmony. Instead, I bought a new lock for my apartment. I changed my number. And then I drove to the lake house, the one Grandpa had left off the books, recorded only in the secondary trust. The one he hadn't taken anyone to in over a decade. It was smaller than I remembered. The paint had begun to peel in places, and the stairs groaned louder than they used to. But the air still smelled the same, cedar and lake and damp soil. Like time suspended itself at the edge of the water. I spent a week there alone. No plans. No screens. Just the notebook, the USB Marissa had given me, and the box of letters I found in the hidden drawer of Grandpa's desk. They were dated across 2 decades. Some addressed to banks, others to partners I'd never heard of. A few to me, unsent, half-finished, folded and tucked behind folders like secrets he couldn't bring himself to share out loud. One in particular stayed with me. "You have something they'll never understand, Amber. You listen. Not obey. Not comply. Listen." I read that line a dozen times. There had been moments during the past month where I doubted myself, deeply, privately. Moments I didn't admit to anyone. Not even Elise. Especially not Elise. Nights where I sat in bed, documents spread across my comforter, wondering if this was revenge masquerading as justice. If I had inherited not only his assets, but his stubbornness. His loneliness. But the silence after the confrontation didn't feel like peace. It felt like exile. Still, I did what he would have done. I got to work. I filed the necessary paperwork to restore the trust's assets to transparency. Liquidated what needed to be liquidated. Closed the offshore accounts and redirected the funds into a community foundation under Grandpa's name. Not to make a point. Just to put things back where they belonged. I hired a team of advisors, not people who smiled too easily or told me what I wanted to hear. People like Elise, who kept their promises small and their data clean. I didn't throw parties. I didn't renovate the house. I didn't buy a car I didn't need. Instead, I made coffee in the mornings and reviewed grants in the afternoons. I scheduled quarterly audits. I joined a board. I volunteered, quietly, on the weekends, the same shelter Grandpa had donated to for 20 years, the same one Patricia pretended to forget existed. And I waited. Because I knew it wasn't over. The family didn't just let go. They paused. It started with Rachel. She reached out via email. 2 sentences. I didn't know everything. I'd like to talk. I didn't answer at first. I waited 5 days, then replied with 1 line. I'm not ready for that. Because I wasn't. Not for whatever version of truth she wanted to present. Not for the guilt she might try to offer up like a peace treaty. But a week later, she tried again. This time with a photo attached. It was old. Faded. Grandpa and me in the back room of the store. I was 12, holding a clipboard twice the size of my hand. He was looking at me, not the camera, smiling, proud. She wrote, I found this in one of Mom's boxes. Thought you should have it. I saved the image. Didn't reply. Because even that gesture, well-intended or not, didn't erase her silence when it mattered. Didn't unsend the email she'd forwarded. Didn't change the fact that when the room turned against me, she didn't stand up. She just looked down. Jason never reached out. I didn't expect him to. I did hear, through Elise's network, that his name came up in a background check at a local casino, flagged for high-risk behavior. That a new vehicle, well beyond his usual means, had been repossessed. That a new job he'd claimed to secure didn't actually exist. Patricia? I heard nothing. Until a letter arrived. Handwritten. No return address. 3 pages of elegant cursive and meticulous blame. She wrote about how grief distorted judgment. How family should come before legal battles. How winning had changed me. How I should consider what my grandfather didn't say, what he left out, and why. She never apologized. She never mentioned the forged signature. She did say, in one strangely lucid line, you always think you're different, but you were raised by me, too. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in the back of the black notebook. Not to preserve it, but to keep it contained. Elise asked me, one evening over drinks, what I wanted from them now. I said, nothing. She said, not even understanding? I thought for a long time before answering. Then said, understanding isn't the same thing as regret. And I meant it. Because regret, when it arrives too late, feels less like a bridge and more like a ghost, hovering, weightless, unfinished. But even still, something lingered. The emails. The anonymous messages. They'd stopped after the confrontation. Vanished without explanation. Until that afternoon at the lake house. I was sorting through Grandpa's safe, the one buried behind the false panel in the closet, when I found a flash drive taped beneath the bottom tray. Unlabeled. Plugging it in, I expected financial records. Tax returns. Maybe more of the same. But it wasn't. It was audio. Recordings. Dozens of them. One by one, I listened. Meetings. Conversations. Phone calls. His voice, calm, meticulous, tired. And theirs. Craig. Patricia. Even mine, once, a recording I didn't know existed from the day he first showed me the Denver property records. And at the end, a single file. Marked only with the date of his final hospital visit. I didn't open it yet. Because something in me knew that whatever was in that last file would change everything again. Some truths don't break you. They free you in ways you didn't know you needed. I listened to the final recording at 2:47 a.m., curled on the floor beside the lake house fireplace, wrapped in one of Grandpa's old flannel blankets that still smelled like cedar and soap. His voice filled the room, quieter, raspier than before, but still steady. Always steady. He began with a date, a timestamp, and then a pause. A long one. Then he said, "Amber, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone. And it means they've come for what isn't theirs." My throat tightened. He continued, speaking slowly, the way he used to when explaining compound interest or the difference between equity and debt. "I didn't leave you the money because I thought you'd spend it well. I left it to you because I knew you wouldn't let it rot." I closed my eyes. Let the words wash over me. "I know you'll do something better than survive. And I know you'll do it without looking back for permission." Another pause. Then his voice softened. "But there's something I never told you." I opened my eyes. He said, "In 1997, there was a loan. A large one. Meant to save the business during a down cycle. Your mother co-signed it without telling your grandmother. And when it defaulted, I covered it, in full. Took years. Almost cost me everything." My chest tightened. I remembered that year. The whispers. The stress. The sudden sale of 2 properties we weren't supposed to talk about. "She never said thank you," he went on. "And I never asked for it. But she made it clear, after that, she believed I owed her. Everything I built. Every dollar. She thought it was hers. Not mine." He sighed. "And I think I tried to believe I could correct her without confronting her. I thought maybe if I gave her small things, she'd stop reaching for everything." I heard the shake in his voice then. "But entitlement doesn't shrink. It multiplies." He was quiet for a long time. I thought the recording had ended. Then he said, "I saw myself in you, Amber. Not just the good parts. The stubbornness. The tendency to carry too much. The silence. That part hurt. I should have told you earlier. I should have made things cleaner, simpler. But part of me wanted to believe they wouldn't do what I knew they would." Another pause. "I was wrong. And then, don't forgive them quickly. They knew." The silence after that line stretched so long I thought again it was over. Then, quietly, "But don't become me either. Protect what matters. Let the rest go." The file ended. The room felt cavernous. I sat in the stillness, letting his voice echo inside me, not as command, but as clarity. For the first time in months, I felt unburdened by the need to prove anything. Not to them. Not to myself. He had known who they were. Who I was. What it would cost. And still, he left it all to me. Not out of favoritism. But out of trust. The next morning, I took a walk through the woods behind the lake house. It was early spring, the air still cold enough to bite but not bitter. The path we used to take was overgrown now, but I knew every bend, every crooked tree branch like a memory that had taken root. At the edge of the lake, I sat on the same bench he built the summer I turned 15. The paint had peeled off years ago, but the wood was solid. I thought about what would come next. There would be taxes. Audits. Quiet conversations about restructuring the foundation. Decisions that no one would see but would ripple out quietly, just the way he taught me. Rachel would reach out again. I could feel it. Maybe one day, I'd reply. Not to reconcile. Not to pretend. But maybe, if she earned it, to explain what integrity actually costs. Jason wouldn't come around. That part, I'd made peace with. He would blame everyone but himself, until he ran out of people to blame. Craig would lie low. He'd cut his losses and try again somewhere else. That was his pattern. Patricia would carry her narrative with her until the end. That I was ungrateful. That I stole something that belonged to her. She would tell her version at brunch tables and bridge games and to anyone who'd listen. Her story would always cast her as the betrayed matriarch. And I'd let her. Because I no longer needed the truth to be public to know it was mine. I didn't move back into the main family home. I sold it quietly. Donated part of the proceeds to a women's legal defense fund. Put the rest into an education endowment for girls from families who didn't believe in them until it was too late. I kept the lake house. Restored it slowly. Sanded the stairs. Repaired the dock. Replanted the garden with perennials that would return each year without needing coaxing. Sometimes Elise came up for long weekends. Sometimes I went alone. There was peace in solitude, but I no longer mistook it for isolation. I started writing again. Not stories. Not articles. Just thoughts. Pages that didn't need to go anywhere. Reflections on what it means to be the one who stays calm while everyone else burns bridges. What it means to win, and what it costs to keep the parts of you that remain. One afternoon, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, I saw a robin building a nest under the eaves. Tiny strands of grass and twigs, placed one by one, with obsessive precision. It made me think of Grandpa. How he built his life. How he passed it down to me, not through money, not through property, but through quiet faith in what I would do when left alone with the choice. And in that moment, watching the bird, I finally understood. The inheritance wasn't the estate. It was the expectation. To protect what's right. To let go of what isn't. To build something that doesn't need to be defended, only maintained. The wind picked up softly, carrying the smell of rain and soil and cedar. I closed my eyes. And for the first time in months, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders, not because the battle was over. But because I'd stopped carrying the parts that weren't mine. There's no real ending to stories like mine. Only a new season. And this time I am not walking into it with fear in my pocket. I'm walking into it with both hands free.